They hid information about the lack of reliability even when they went the first time for the warrant. But in January, after the election, the entire case collapsed when the principal source says, I never told Steele this stuff. And this was all speculation. And I have zero information to support this stuff. At that point, when their entire case collapsed, what did they do? They kept on investigating the president and well into his administration after the case collapsed. But here, to me, is the damning thing. They not only didn't tell the court that what they had been relying on was completely rubbish. They actually started putting in things to bolster the Steele report by saying, well, we talked to the sources and they appeared to be truthful. But they don't inform the court that what they're truthful about is that the dossier is false. So that's hard to explain. And the core statement, in my opinion, by the IG is that these irregularities, these misstatements, these omissions were not satisfactorily explained. And I think that leaves open the possibility to infer bad faith. I think it's premature now to reach a judgment on that, but I think that further work has to be done, and that's what Durham is doing.
This, of course, is where the Inspector General is most critical of the FBI. And when you say bad faith, are you saying a bias? Because there can be all sorts of bias. There could be political bias, confirmation bias. What do you think happened?
Well, I think there are a number of scenarios, but I don't want to get into them. I think there could have been a lot of motivations involved, and different motivations. And there could have been motivations in the FBI and motivations outside the FBI by other players in this. This thing focuses on the FBI. There was a lot going on around this that is not the subject matter of Horowitz's report, but I think has a direct bearing, perhaps, on what was going on in the FBI.
Based on what you know so far, do you still stand by your statement that the campaign was spied upon?
Well, it's clearly spied upon. I mean, that's what electronic surveillance is. I think wiring people up to go in and talk to people and make recordings of their conversations is spying. I think going through people's emails, which they did as a result of the FISA warrant, they went through everything, from Page's life.
Of course, he wasn't in the campaign at the point where they began the surveillance.
Yes, but his emails go back. I mean, the main reason they were going for the FISA warrant initially was to go back historically and seize all his emails and texts and all that stuff from back months and even years. So they were covering the period that he was in the campaign, and that's exactly the reason they went for the FISA, to get that stuff.
So what do you think, what questions will John Durham address that the IG didn't?
Well, Durham is looking at the whole waterfront. He is looking at the issue of how it got started. He's looking at whether or not the narrative of Trump being involved in the Russian interference actually preceded July and wasn't, in fact, the precipitating trigger for the investigation. He's also looking at the conduct of the investigation. There are some things that were done in the investigation that are not included in Horowitz's report, and he's looking at those things. But also, a few weeks ago, I told him that he should spend just as much attention on the post-election period. And I did that because of some of the stuff that Horowitz has uncovered, which to me is inexplicable.
Inexplicable.
Well, what I said is their case collapsed after the election, and they never told the court, and they kept on getting renewals on these applications. There was documents falsified in order to get these renewals. There was all kinds of withholding of information from the court. And the question really is, what was the agenda after the election that kept them pressing ahead after their case collapsed? This is the President of the United States.
You, of course, went to 3 countries with him. Why did you have to do that? And some people have said, well, this is clearly Bill Barr's in charge of the investigation.
Well, the presentation of that in the media has been silly. The person running the investigation is John Durham. But this is a very unusual circumstance where we are going to foreign governments and asking them to assist and cooperate including some of their sensitive materials and personnel. And a U.S. attorney doesn't show up on the doorstep in some of these countries like London and say, hey, I want to talk to your intelligence people and so forth. All the regularities were followed. I went through my purpose was to introduce Durham to the appropriate people and set up a channel that he could work with these countries. At the request of the country, I went through the ambassadors of each country, and the governments wanted to initially talk to me to find out, what is this about? What are the ground rules? Is this going to be a criminal case? Are you going to do a public report? They wanted to understand the ground rules before they met with Durham, and I met with him, and then I set up appropriate channels. This was perfectly appropriate.
Speaking of whether something is appropriate or not, was it appropriate for John Durham to issue his statement yesterday, given that he's a U.S. attorney with a grand jury and his investigation isn't done yet?
I think it was definitely appropriate because I think it was necessary to avoid public confusion. I think it was sort of being reported by the press that the issue of predication was sort of done and over, even though it was a very limited look at that issue by the IG, given the narrowness of his, of the evidence available to him. And I think it was important for people to understand that Durham's work was not being preempted. And that Durham was doing something different, and he explains what he's doing different, and that there are areas of disagreement. I think it was perfectly appropriate so the public understood the relationship between the two exercises.
So you've outlined a number, and so does the Inspector General, of problems with the way the FBI handled this investigation. Are you confident that Chris Wray can fix them? And I ask that in light of the President's tweet today where he says, I don't know what report current Director Wray was reading, but it sure wasn't the one given to me. With that kind of attitude, he'll never be able to fix the FBI.
Well, practically speaking, I think Chris has been working hard to address the problems of the past. We've worked well together. The people who were involved in the past are no longer there. He's brought in a new team that I think is a good team. I have confidence in that team. And I think he has set forth a number of specific proposals as to how to address those problems. And I think what the President was getting at, and I feel the same way, is that we can't ignore the abuses of the past and appear to be justifying them or minimizing them. We have to focus on getting it right going forward.
So you have confidence in Chris Wray?
Yes.
Before I go into a couple of other questions, let me just sort of button this up. I think a lot of people will hear what you're saying here and think, well, that's just Bill Barr defending Trump. Your concern about the FBI's investigation is what? Civil libertarian?
I think our nation was turned on its head for 3 years. I think based on a completely bogus narrative that was largely fanned and hyped by an irresponsible press. And I think that there were gross abuses of FISA and inexplicable behavior that is intolerable in the FBI. And the Attorney General's primary responsibility is to protect against the abuse of the law enforcement and intelligence apparatus and make sure that it doesn't play an improper role in our political life. That's my responsibility, and I'm going to carry it out.
A couple of other questions. Were you ever